Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the City of Farmers Branch study session for Tuesday, May 21st. Thank you all for being here. Let me just start off by saying on study session agenda, item B5 is going to be moved to regular agenda. That will become M3. B5 becomes M3. Councilman Jackson is on jury duty today. He should be here in time for the regular meeting. So, with that, we'll get started. First up is item B1, discuss regular agenda items. Councilman Roman?
No, I don't have anything.
Very good. Councilman Reed?
I do not.
All right. Councilman Baird?
Not me.
Excellent.
Thank you, sir. Nothing for me.
Okay, Councilman Neal, I just want to say it. All right. Moving on, B2, discuss topics for the proposed fiscal year 24-25 budget meetings and related timing.
Council Mayor Tammy Zimmerman, Director of Finance. So it's officially budget season, and we discuss next year's budget cycle and what topics we want to delve deeper into. Local governments must balance their budgets and ensure that all departments have sufficient fundings to meet the needs of our citizens. So this budget puts the City Council's vision for the future by taking care of our Farmers Branch residents and the employees, and sets the tone for our 24-25 work plan. So this is our budget kickoff. We'll be talking about the budget quite a bit this summer. And you'll see this budget timeline quite a bit in the presentations. So our budget process is really a year-round process, and some of the council will be new to this process, and some of you are old hat at it. But our summer council sessions will be pretty busy with budget. Our fiscal year starts October 1st, and we transfer in our newly adopted budget while wrapping up the prior year's financial activity. And then October through February, we're going through our audit and preparing our annual comprehensive financial report. February this year, the council met to affirm the strategic initiatives and objectives that the departments should use in their budget planning. March is the presentation of our audit results.
Okay, I forgot.
And April and May, we reviewed our financial statements, and we just did a mid-year budget revision. And we started meeting last week with our departments to go over their budget request. So we'll continue to do that in May and June. The Budget Committee will meet continuously with the departments and go over a draft budget that we prepare for the council. So then July 6th, we have July we get certified tax results from Dallas County Appraisal District, DCAD. And we'll put the budget out on the 31st, and that will be on our website, and you can easily find it on our transparency page. We are proposing a budget town hall on August 27th, and we have several council meetings in August and September where we have public hearings and votes on our tax rate, our fees, and our budget. Budget themes. So based on City Council's direction and the strategic initiative planning, we hope to have several positive themes for our budget this coming year. We're going to keep building on being open and transparent and fiscally conservative while offering first-in-class services for the city of Farmers Branch. Last year's budget emphasized a reduced tax rate, public safety funding. We had fleet and facilities funding to replace our aging infrastructure and our vehicles. And we set up a new model with our revenue stabilization fund and increasing our reserves. And it was also discussed strategic debt planning and keeping a low debt ratio and maintaining our AAA bond rating. So we'll have topics that we bring to City Council during study sessions where we discuss CIP, our capital improvement programs, our salaries, benefits, special events, fixed assets, medians, fees, and positions. And we'll again be discussing our revenue sources, fund balances is a key component to our budget, and transfers, which is a way to transfer between funds. And we're going to be talking about how we reach out to our public and have conversations about our budget. We had a good turnout last year with our budget town hall. We hope to increase that attendance. And then we had some pamphlets and forms and our websites and our videos that we hope to continue to have that outreach. Again, the study session topics are coming up next. And we will have that budget town hall on August 27th, the public hearings about the budget and the tax rates, and the final adoption on September 17th. So I'll keep re-emphasizing all of the steps along the way. So as we are preparing our fiscal year 24-25 budget, the starting point for municipal budgets is our revenue and forecasting our major revenue sources. And like with any other business, we have vulnerabilities with our revenue sources. We have a comptroller's rule 3.334, which could impact our sales tax. We have, in case a large business were to leave, it could take a significant percentage of our sales tax revenue. And then with our property tax, there is the growth cap with Senate Bill 2 that takes us down to 3.5% growth. So we will start with the sales tax revenue planning. And this is our most elastic revenue source. It fluctuates with consumer spending and inflation. And we discussed last year with this graph, we did an analysis, and we were one of the cities that maintained that high peak compared to our neighboring cities. And we were starting to show that trend downward from the peak. And we had discussed in this analysis where our median level would be. And that median line is that blue line, dotted line on there, at 4.33%. And we discussed that would represent $23 million in sales tax. Anything in addition to that, we would sweep into our revenue stabilization fund. And as of now, we are tracking at $23 million of sales tax for this fiscal year. So we're projecting a lower amount for 24-25 by $1 million. Another major revenue source is our property tax revenue. Until we get certified tax values from DCAD, we're just forecasting a decrease to our property tax rate. On July 25th, we get the values from DCAD and we can calculate the actual decrease, and then we turn around and we submit the budget on the 31st. We are trying to schedule a meeting with DCAD to come to City Farmers Branch and have a Q&A with our citizens and go over what their evaluation process is, and we'll let you know when that's available and can be set up. Now, the Senate Bill 2 that I have mentioned before, House Bill Senate 2, it was a cap on your city and county budgets where it's your M&O rate, your maintenance and operation rate of your property tax is capped at 3.5% growth. Now, that does not include any new construction. But what we're finding is that with most local cities and counties, we're struggling with the unprecedented inflation that has outpaced that 3.5% cap. And a reminder that the property tax revenue for the city, we are only 25% of your property tax bill. 50% is your school districts. And school districts' budgets are, they're calculated differently. They have a 2.5% cap. It's a different model. So we're going to talk about that Senate Bill 2 has been shifting cities to increasing their INS rates. And INS stands for your interest and sinking rate, with this cap of the M&O rate of 3.5%, M&O, maintenance and operation. So for current year, our tax rate is 0.569. We have a homestead exemption of 20% and a senior and disabled exemption of $100,000. And with Senate Bill 2, we have some new terminology. So it put together a calculation called your Truth in Taxation form, which in the back of your budget book, it takes up about 11 pages. It's not an easy calculation, but it came up with new terminology. So a voter approval tax rate with unused increment, we had calculated last year at 0.573559. We proposed the tax rate, and so that top bar is the maximum. We had proposed a tax rate of 0.569, which was below the maximum. A no new revenue tax rate is another terminology that's created with Senate Bill 2, and that means just taking what our assessed valuations are and what that rate would be to be the exact same amount of revenue. And then there's the voter approval tax rate without unused increment. And what I might mention with that 3.5%, I've talked about cap, that is on the M&O tax rate. And that means that if you exceed that, you have to go out to the voters for approval. So before I get a little bit more into this debt strategy slide, we talked about record inflation and the 3.5% cap on our property tax. So, in looking at some major categories of what the rates for inflation are, I looked to our Public Works Department for what has been the cost for street overlay, and it's averaging about 6.2% inflationary rates on an annual basis. Our fleet, nationally, it's a 35% inflationary rate, and that's not including probably our public safety, our big fire department trucks, which we saw there's a decrease in the vendors and there's an increase in demand, so those costs have substantially increased. Personnel services, that's another category where we saw labor shortages, and it's still a very competitive market out there for retaining staff. So benefits that go along with that have been on an inflationary rate of 8 to 15%. So we wanted to talk about debt strategy as we're dealing with the inflationary cost and our cap on our property tax and the volatility of our sales tax revenue. So we're not alone. Most North Texas cities are dealing with this. We've had many discussions on how can we continue to be fiscally conservative. And what does fiscally conservative mean? Still lowering our tax rates, having a lean budget. We're having low debt. We are being prudent with utilizing our resources and still maintaining high levels of services to our citizens. And it's not easy to cover these growing costs with the increasing cost of our salaries and raw materials. So we want to dig more into our debt strategy, and I'll be coming forward with future council meetings, and especially at our budget retreat, where we'll bring in our investment advisors, Hilltop Securities, to talk a little bit more on possibly using debt for funding of our fleet, in particular our fire fleet. We also have street overlay, which is a huge cost to our budget. And we're still having a minimum debt level and not affecting our AAA bond rating. So we'll have Hilltop Securities come in and discuss the market as well, and go over any concerns that the council has. And that's just kind of the kickoff. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Tammy. I think we're all anticipating many more meetings and weeks of discussion as we start getting into the budget. So with that, Councilman Roman?
So can you go back to your slide where you talked about the different rates, the no new revenue, that one? So how much do we have left of an unused increment, and how long do we have to use that for?
That's a good question. So the unused increment is over with, so there is no more left.
Okay. If we were to lower the tax rate, well, let me ask this question. This might be a better question. How do you get an unused increment that you can then carry forward for future
So
years?
that was when they adopted Senate Bill 2, and they dropped the growth rate from 8% to 3.5% rate. They gave you 3 years for this unused increment, and that 3 years is over with.
Okay,
So there's no more building up an unused increment.
Got it. So that was something that occurred as a result of the new legislation being put in place.
A phasing in
yeah.
approach, yes.
Okay. And I think as we're talking about the budget, there are, I think, some questions that I have, although I think they might be more appropriate for an executive session to seek legal guidance on those. So I'm not sure if it'd be best to go into executive session now or to maybe handle those questions at the time in which maybe we would have an already executive session going on.
Maybe it might, let me just suggest that we get a little further into the budget process. We can certainly do that. And I think several of us will have questions related to things that just aren't ready to be discussed openly as it relates to the expense of doing business in the city.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we were all on the same page on all items that might be coming forward that might impact our budget.
Sure.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Councilman Reed?
Just more of an informative thing, the no new revenue tax rate, understand how it's calculated. How does that fit into the budget process? Or does it?
So it's a calculation that we're required to present, if that makes more sense. It's showing keeping steady, no new revenue, and then you could put on the 3.5% growth. Now, there's some calculations with the new construction that you have to take advantage of. So again, it's in those 11 pages of the back of your budget book, Truth in Taxation. So it's just a new terminology and goes into all of our
So
calculations.
it's like one of the baselines. Thank you.
Correct.
I'm good.
Councilman Baird?
Nothing. I'm looking forward to all the studying.
Okay, very
Everything
good.
at this point.
Councilman Neal?
Yeah, I just had one question, or maybe two questions for you, Tammy. You mentioned that there was a schedule or planning for a public hearing sometime in September. Is that correct?
So we are required to have public hearings on our tax rate and then the budget
Okay.
as well.
My question was, is it possible we can have more than one for the residents
Yes.
to participate in case they cannot make maybe one of their sides?
Yes,
I'd
and-
like us to really look into having at least multiple. for the
Multiple
for the
public
residents.
hearings.
Yeah.
And that would be a good idea to discuss what we want to present
Sure.
as far as the town hall meetings as well.
Okay. And then you made mention of vehicles, particularly the fire department vehicles, being quite expensive. Do we have, or maybe the city manager has, do we have a list of fixed assets regarding valuations of the equipment that we have now, how old they are, that sort of stuff to help us in our budgeting as we go forward?
Absolutely, and unfortunately, the need far outweighs it. This is a way to hedge against decisions of the past and also supply chain logistics. But yes, in short, we have that list specifically for fire, but the whole fleet as well. But fire is where we see the critical need.
Is that something you can share with us?
Absolutely.
In the near future? Okay. Thank you, Mayor, that's all I have.
You're welcome. So, thank you for your question regarding, I had one note down here, is one town hall enough? So we will have discussion on that as we get further into this. I would suggest that we have conversation to discuss, instead of that 90-day target, maybe moving that target to 120 days.
The reserves, you're talking
Yes.
about the general fund, unassigned fund balance, that's the
So-
reserves, yes.
That, I think, would help us long run. And then, we had one more. Kim, I may have written it down elsewhere. So I'll just leave it at that. And maybe we look at having discussion about moving that to 120. So, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll continue this all summer.
Okay. Before we continue, I do want to take a step back to ask if there's anybody here that's interested in any type of public comment or citizen comment prior to us continuing the study session. Seeing none. How are you? Seeing none. Thank you. Next up is B3, discuss the city's strategic compensation initiatives.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Jeffrey Ross, Deputy Director of Human Resources. Tammy's a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best here today. There's a lot of information to go through, so I'm going to kind of go high level, and I'll answer any questions that anybody has. There's just a few things that we want to call out specifically. Okay, so some of the things we'll talk about will be some of our current advantages and opportunities that we have as a city as it relates to recruiting and retaining employees. Our methodology and our strategy for how we've evaluated our compensation programs. We'll look at the comparative analysis that we ran with the market, and we'll look at some different pay strategy recommendations for the upcoming budget year. Okay, so to talk about some of those current advantages, we do have a very strong recruiting angle. So I was just at a job fair last week, and everybody wanted to talk to us specifically. We've got a great benefits flyer that we pass out, and they all have the same question. Tell me how 4-day work weeks work. 4-day work weeks have been absolutely transformational in our ability to recruit and retain talent. City contributions to our HSA and our dependent care FSA accounts. We are the only city that offers a contribution to the dependent care FSA. We do a match on that up to $1,000. We do have day one benefits, which new employees have expressed that is a great benefit for them. And we also provide 40 hours of vacation at start for employees. We have strong market positions from a compensation standpoint in public safety. And in public safety, we do have significantly low turnover rates. As well as in public safety, we have 410 schedules for certain police positions and a 4896 schedule for fire coming in October of 2024. One of the things that really helps set apart our programs for both police and fire is that we have a lateral hiring program. So that means we're not taking the time to train and send through academies our new police officers and firefighters. We have lateral programs that allows us to get already trained and already, in most cases, ready to go police officers and firefighters. So those are some of the current advantages that we have that definitely help us give us a good angle on our recruiting efforts. Some current opportunities that we have as we started looking through our current compensation programs. We are a market-based pay system, and most of what I'm going to talk about right here relates only to our general employee population. It doesn't relate to our public safety, which is on somewhat of a different analysis, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So we looked at a number of different things with our market-based pay structures. And some of the things that we notice is there's some inconsistency in our position minimums. Some are set currently between 20 to 24% of our midpoint. We'll talk about structures here in just a moment and give you a good visual of what that looks like. But essentially what that means is we're desired to hire 20 to 24% below market. Now 20% below the midpoint for a minimum of a salary range is pretty common. You don't usually see it go much lower than that, though. So what we noticed is there was no rhyme or reason for why we're some 23, 22, 24, right? So we're normalizing all that now to put everything at a flat 20% there. So we don't have job families right now, which means that it's a challenge when we're evaluating positions. It's a challenge when we're trying to evaluate positions that sit in the same pay grade. You may have a IT position that sits in the same pay grade as a professional level position, or in some cases even a skilled trade position or something similar, right? So when we go to evaluate the market, we're moving rates based on the study of positions that sit in the same ones, and an IT person is paid much different and evaluated much differently than a professional level position or a skilled labor position. So we don't currently have job families, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Pay range compression, we've noticed about the difference between pay grades is that for our position midpoints, there's only 5% between the position midpoints, which causes very tight compression between our positions. Position bloat, we also have a number of positions with multiple levels. So think specialist 1, specialist 2, specialist 3, things like that. That can indicate positions that have at one point or another been created for people rather than purpose. And we do have a plan to study that and fix some of that. We've already done that with some of our administrative positions, and we'll use that same strategy, and it was very effective. We'll use that same strategy as we move forward to correct some of that. And finally, our use of range guidelines. So we have some outdated practices and understandings on pay decisions, internal equity, supervisor compression. Long story short is that we need to educate the workforce on how to use our compensation programs and our salary ranges, how to use them as a tool, not just something that they talk about. We need to use it as an actual functional tool for hiring and retention. Another opportunity that we have, one area that we focused on pretty heavily, and we'll talk about it through today, is the job family that we're referring to as skilled labor and technical positions. And I want to talk just a little bit about what those are. So as we think about skilled labor and technical type positions, these are, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is our great crews who work on our streets. They're out there fixing our traffic signals, things like that. The folks out there in the field, but it's also our people in the detention center. It's our detention officers and the detention supervisors. It's also the folks who work at the animal shelter, who need a number of different licenses and technical skills to be able to take care of animals, right? So when we talk about this skilled labor family, we notice some lag with the skilled labor family. Specifically, one area that everyone is struggling with right now, both in the private and the public sector, are CDL holders, commercial driver's license holders. There's fewer and fewer of them out there, and they're commanding a premium in the market for what they make. So that's one that we knew, and we struggle with recruitment here of CDL holders just like everyone. So we took a specific look, a really deep dive on the market for CDL positions and where we currently are in relation to that. And as part of that study, what I didn't want was any skewing of the information, of the data. So one thing I didn't evaluate was what's known as over-the-road drivers, right? These are your actual truck drivers. They drive a truck for Walmart or, just any other organization. They're paid at a much higher rate. So I didn't want that to overinflate our numbers. So I didn't study any of those. I only studied CDL positions that were similar to ours. They operate heavy equipment, things like that. So what we did notice from that is that we do have pay starting somewhere between 27 to 43% less than private sector equivalents for CDL positions. The private sector is where a large majority of the competition exists for these types of skilled labor positions. The public sector is typically slow to catch up, and there's lack of visibility for jobs. We recently attended a job fair at Lincoln Technical Institute and talked to a large number of people there. And most of them said, well, what is the City of Farmers Branch? What do you even do? So there's just not enough outreach there. So we're finding new partners, we're finding new pathways to meet with these different organizations, create some partnerships to be able to create some pipelines for talent. And then finally, just the diminishing market for skilled labor and CDL in general. A fair number of folks are retiring and they're not returning to the workforce, and there's not a lot of people learning these skills that are leaving the workforce. So the demand is high and the supply is low. So as we move into talking about some of the solutions and some of the recommendations that we have for some of these opportunities that we have in front of us, before we get into talking about our recommendations and how we got to where we were, I think it's very important when we talk about compensation strategy, that we talk about how we start, because how we start is one of the most important parts. And we take a very empirical approach to this. So prior to even collecting the data, the first thing we did was study how many positions do we actually need to study as part of this to reach a statistically significant number, for this to be an empirical study. And so we determined through a formula that we needed to study at least 67 positions in order to reach 95% confidence level in our study. We studied 103, so we studied way more than we needed to. And so I feel good about the data that we were able to pull. We went to a few different sources for the data. So we had 17 direct metro partners, and we included a lot of the big ones, the ones that we know are our biggest competition, the Planos, the Irvings, the Friscos, things like that. We also have a tool called PayScale, which allows us to get tens of thousands of data points for both the public and the private sector, and we can further drill it down to be specific to the DFW area. So not just looking nationally at what's happening with this position or that position, but what's happening just here within the local DFW North Texas area. We matched to 75% of essential functions and comparable skill sets. With a lot of compensation studies, jobs are matched to job titles. So accountant equals accountant, and it's paid at this rate. But there's all sorts of different types of accountants. There's tax accountants, staff accountants, payroll accountants, right? We needed to make sure that our accountant matched what they were saying their accountants are, right? So for ones that weren't at least somewhere within a close match of essential function or authority or scope, things like that, we cut them from the study because they weren't going to be a good match for us. That's a little bit about how we started, and I did want to highlight that just because it's very important. Now, this is a very involved slide, and you have it here in your packet, so I'm going to kind of give a high level of some of the different notes here. But after we collected the data, we analyzed the data, and so we determined the market rate for the positions that we studied by calculating the median across the data sets. We then compared our own data to that market data, and to determine essentially where is the market going to move in the following year, what we expect it to move, we calculated that based on some information that we have both from our Metroplex partners and from some federal wage growth trackers. We then projected the market forward by 4.6% to determine where maybe we should move for the following year raises. This year only, as you heard me talk about, we don't have job families. We've built job families for all of our positions. So now we have job families for each position now lives in its correct job family, so that we have an easier time of evaluating the market, and we make sure when we move those ranges, we're moving those ranges appropriately to the job family. We've also rebuilt our pay ranges and reconfigured everything about them. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to provide some consistency to them by setting the range minimums no less than 20%, the range maximums no more than 20% above midpoint. And then we're setting the new range midpoints somewhere within 5% of the studied market medians for those positions. We're also going to educate hiring managers. Now that we'll have new tools, we'll have job families. We're going to educate them on how to use these new tools as part of their recruitment and retention practices. Next, one thing that we'd like to discuss is to determine our compensation strategy, which essentially drives how we educate our workforce, our hiring managers, how we communicate our compensation programs. So currently, the strategy is to aim for 105% of the average starting salary as it's expressed in the budget book. So that's not necessarily achievable or sustainable. So, and it has a number, there's not really a lot of action that we can take on that there. So what we are going to ask is that you consider a new strategy, which is to aim for market with a plus minus 5% tolerance. And I'll have a visual here in a moment that will help kind of put together what that looks like. But we are going to ask you to determine or at least consider a new compensation strategy. And then from there, we're going to maintain that strategy. So we're going to regularly educate leadership teams on our strategy. We're going to continually monitor for equity, compression, position bloat, and a lot of other key compensation metrics. So there's not a single offer that goes out to any candidate in this city without myself or the city manager having their eyes on it, especially if that's going to be something that's going to go above midpoint, if it's going to cause peer compression, things like that. We're stopping these things before they can even go forward so that we can provide some correction and education for them. We do have a very effective approval process that we did not have previously. These things that I'm talking about right now, these are all new things that we've brought in within the past year. The current approval process that we have for anybody that wants to change a position, oh, well, I want this accountant to be a senior accountant, or I want this to be this. If they want to make any changes to position, I want to do a reorganization of my department, things like that. It has to go through an approval process where the city manager and human resources staff sit down and we evaluate all the information, talk about recommendations, talk about alternatives, things like that before we move forward on anything. And then as part of the strategy, we would evaluate the market every year, and as the market warrants, as it moves, we would adjust our pay ranges every 2 to 3 years as the market shows. Okay, so just very quickly, because I did mention that we have market-based ranges here, so it's important to understand how we administer our market-based ranges. We don't use any type of point-based system to determine where our positions fall in a classification, right, in a pay grade. So we go straight to the market and we study every single one to make sure that it's aligned correctly. Right, so every position, and again, this is only for our general employees positions. We'll talk about police and fire in just a moment. But for every position, there's a minimum, a midpoint, and a maximum. And the way they work is that your midpoint of any given position is set equal to your studied and established market median. You've looked at the market and you said, this is what what the market pays for this type of position with proper tenure and experience and skill set. Your minimum is set 20% below that, and the maximum is set 20% above the midpoint amount. From there, we break it down a little bit further. We can evaluate using a formula. We can evaluate where people fall within their range. So, as we talked about with considering a new strategy, our ideal market position is going to be somewhere between plus or minus 5% of the midpoint of the market, right, as it relates to the midpoint, right? So that would be our ideal market position for our job families to be sitting in. From there, we can break the ranges down even further to establish different quadrants that we can establish to see where do people currently sit in their range. So if we're thinking about midpoint as the market and the minimum is 20% below the market, we're talking about the minimum is the absolute bottom of the range, right? These are people who are coming in well below the market. Conversely, same thing for the maximum. These are people who are paid well above the market if they're close to the maximum of their position. To kind of look at what that means from an employee standpoint, we've got, this is our current employee count for who falls where within those different percentages there, right? And so right now we have roughly 60% of the workforce that's sitting below our market target, right, of that plus minus 5%. People who are more than 5% below the midpoint of their position. In that very bottom sector, you can see we have 81% of people who are in the bottom 10% of their range. And so what we see for that, if you remember, I talked about the skilled labor section, the technical folks. They represent 60.5% of that total number there. That's 49 people. 49 of that 81 are in our skilled labor family. So it just kind of gives an idea of how we look at people, where they are related in their range, related to their midpoint in the market. So as we looked at the data and we started trying to determine, okay, how do we start to move the needle a little bit? How do we start to evaluate what we're going to do for increases in the next year? So the recommendation that we're bringing to you is to adjust position by range quartile. So we're going to look at every position that we have, find where they fall in what's called a range quartile. We break the range into 4 separate quartiles, the bottom 10% all the way up to the top 10%, right? So, and I've got that listed out here what that means. So what that means is to try and provide an equitable recommendation to essentially where we need to move the needle the most, the folks that fall within the first quartile of their range, that's going to be the bottom 10% of the range, are going to get a larger increase than, say, the people who are in the fourth quartile, which is the top 10% of their range, right? So we've looked at it this way by using the quartiles in order to be able to structure it and say this for this person, right? And at the time that we would do raises, we have a method to determine who gets what and when. So to kind of look at it visually of what that looks like, as we look at our job families that I described to you earlier, this is where they currently sit in relation to essentially the market. And I wanted to provide an overview also of the percent of the workforce that each job family makes up. So you can see that our skilled trade workforce, they make up more than half of our general civilian workforce, our general employees. They make up more than half of them. And they're the most far outside of our market target. So you can see kind of the distance from the market from where they currently sit, both in the chart there and on the visual line. Now, what we're recommending, as I just talked about, if we take the recommendation to adjust everybody by their quartile, this is how it moves the needle for these folks by job family. So you can see this information here. Now, as we look at that option and we think back to, well, how many people were in the bottom 10% of the range, how does this affect essentially where people sit in their range relative to the market? So if we overlay here, we can show you, if we take that recommendation, how it moves the different numbers through that. And you have this information in your packet as well. So to shift from general employees and move to police and fire, their ranges work a little bit differently. And I'm going to use a firefighter as an example here of how their step-based ranges work. Whereas our general employees are on a market-based range, our police and fire are on a step-based range. So the way step-based ranges work is that there's different steps throughout. And between each step, these steps are tenure-based, generally based on years of service in most every organization, including here. So they're tenure-based, year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Generally, there's 1 to 5% between each step for each rank. So a rank would be firefighter, fire driver, captain, battalion chief, things like that. Those are your ranks. So for the firefighter rank, there's 5% between each step that you see here. Now, how we evaluate it in the market is for police officers and firefighters only, the entry rank for each of those. We're looking at the entry step for each one of those positions. And we're trying to find out, how do we compare for recruitment based on everybody else? So we're looking at everybody else's pay plan. Which isn't varied at all. Just like ours is a set amount, if you're a year 1 officer here, you make this amount. In other cities, if you're a year 1 officer there, you make that same amount in that other city, right? So there's not a lot of variation in the data that way. But we're able to see where we pay at entry for a new firefighter or police officer, we evaluate that same information for other cities. In addition to that, we also evaluate the top out pay for all of the ranks. So we're looking at it for all of the ranks, including police sergeants, police lieutenants, battalion chiefs, things like that. We look at what's the top out pay, because the top out pay is a very important metric to look at as it determines longevity for police officers. Do they have good longevity here? If they stay with us their entire career, are they going to be paid appropriately? Are they going to be paid competitive to the market? And then for them, we do look at where they fall within essentially the market rate for that rank in the same way that we would for the general employees. So generally, we like them to live somewhere between plus minus 5% of that market. Okay. And so as we look at police as where they currently sit, so this is the current information for police, we look at the different ranks. And for officers, I've evaluated the 2 different ones. So we have the officer at entry and we have the officer at the top. And I also took a look at the 5-year officer. What do our 5-year officers make compared to other 5-year officers in other organizations? Because what the data shows me, what our turnover data shows me for our police and fire is if they stay with us at least 5 years and they stay with us their entire career, is what our turnover data indicates. And so this is where they currently sit. And what we're suggesting for public safety this year is 3% increase to all of the ranks and all of the steps. And this is how that moves the needle for them. So you can see they're already very competitive in the market. So there's not already a lot of variation that's going to happen because we're not having to take big, massive efforts to try and move the needle for them. It's going to be the same for fire. So we look at fire and where they currently sit for each rank. And then we compare that to how they move given a 3% step increase to all steps in all ranks. And one thing that I did want to highlight on this specific slide is when we see some of these numbers, like if we see for the firefighter top, we're talking about a career firefighter, they want to make their career here. If we compare that to all of the market cities that we looked at, what does that negative 3.2% behind the market really mean? Well, it's about a difference of $3,200 a year, right? So if we break that down per paycheck, what our turnover data indicates is that people aren't leaving for, maybe $100 more per paycheck, right? We have great benefits here. We've got great culture in both departments. They're staying for those reasons. So to recap and wrap it up, these are the three different groups that we have, and these are the recommendations that we're making as part of the budget process for what we do in October as far as employee raises go. To give an idea of what it looks like compared to previous years, I have provided a look back on it. So you can see that what we're recommending for this year is less than we've spent in the previous 3 years. So, and we'll be able to affect one of the groups that needs the help the most, being the skilled labor family. With that, I'm happy to take any questions or comments that anybody has.
Thank you very much. Councilman Roman?
Can you go back to your slide where you had your, it's like, there's this chain of the data
Oh,
and
sure.
stuff? So the first one, you talked about collect the data and you talked about the different sources that you use. Is the data that's collected there, is that all self-reported or is that information that comes directly from an employer source?
So for the 17 direct metro partners, that's directly from the cities themselves. We actually invited them out here during the summer, and we asked them to essentially participate in this huge study, and we asked them to do it our way. So we had great response from them, especially from the cities that we needed. Now, some cities that we needed, say Grand Prairie, Dallas, Carrollton, they didn't respond to the survey. So what we did is we got what we call data dumps from them, which gives us all of their employee data and all of their job descriptions. And myself and my compensation specialist, we sat down and we went through every job description one by one and matched those because we knew that those were cities that we were going to need as part of this study.
And what about the rest?
So the pay scale public and the pay scale private, those ones there's two different sources within pay scale. There's HR reported from HR salary surveys, and then there's employee reported in the pay scale data. So we take both of those and pay scale mashes them together, and then it gives us, this is the rate for this type of position.
Okay, so it's a mix. Some of the data is employer provided, some of the data is self-reported from an employee.
Correct,
Okay.
yes, sir.
And then as you're talking about the ways in which you see increasing salaries based off of families or groups, have you explored the approach of having it merit-based rather than a flat general increase for anybody who is encompassed in that specific group or family?
Sure. So it's a great question. We did merit increases last year for everybody but public safety, and that's general in public safety. Public safety usually is not eligible for merit because of the way their steps work. But for general employees, we did merit last year. We don't have a good system for merit increases for determining equitable merit distribution. It is something that we're going to work on so that we can bring it back. But in general, I think that catching up to the market making sure that we're aligned with market before we start determining, let's move people based on merit without knowing where the market is going to be a better approach. And then once we're essentially caught up to the market, once we're comfortable with where we're at the market, that's where we can look at bringing in the right type of merit program that has the right kind of fencing around it.
I hear what you're saying. I'm still struggling with it, and I think for me, I'd be more supportive of some sort of system that specifically determines whether individuals are overperformers, and have consistently done their job in a way that is consistent with the city's expectations and our residents' expectations, and then rewarding them accordingly. I think those employees that aren't doing that, and maybe there are, maybe there aren't, then I think then those are handled separately. That's just my thought on that. And then there was a graph that you had presented that went through and showed the hourly as well as the annual salaries. Was it for fire?
Yes, sir. That's going to
Okay.
be for police and fire.
Okay,
How they're
just-
set up.
Help me understand where I'm a little bit confused. So if I take the hourly rate of $34.46, there's 40 hours per week, 52 weeks, those multiplied together is 2,080, and 34.46 multiplied by 2,080 to annualize it is not 94,973, it's 71,676. So help me understand where, maybe there's something I'm missing about the way that they're paid that I'm not understanding.
We pay fire differently.
Okay.
They're paid off an annual hour of 2,756 with the way that their 24-hour scheduling works. So for everybody else, including police, we base it off the 2080, as you said. For fire specifically, it's based off 2,756.
Okay.
And they're paid hourly, and we do have these ranges posted out on the website. The annual amount is a good, the annual amount works as a good advertising tool with mandatory overtime and things like that. The annual amount is never going to be accurate because there's always going to be overtime and things like that. So, but it's a great way. One of the things we do have coming this year, if these recommendations are approved, is both police and fire at the entry level will both start at above 80,000 a year. Just a little bit above 80,000,
Yeah.
which is a great recruitment tool.
Okay.
Very, very few other cities have that claim that they can make.
Okay. I think that answers all my questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, sir.
Thank you. Councilman Reed.
I want to echo Councilman Roman's idea regarding the meritocracy. That's, I think that's always been a great way to promote behavior. I just wanted to get confirmation. You had said that the analysis basically, is it determining the median? Is that done every year?
We'll do that every year. We'll create that effort and replicate it every year to make sure that we're keeping up. In
Okay.
some years, we may need to move ranges based on how much the market moves, but generally you only move them every 2, maybe 3 years, because in a year's time, the market doesn't really move enough to justify altering the structure.
Okay. So it's an annual thing to kind of keep pace on?
Yes,
it?
sir, we do this
Okay.
annually.
Right, that's all I had.
Thank you. Councilman Baird.
Can you go back to the loop of
Sure.
green and blue?
Sir.
Loop of analysis.
There you go. At the bottom left, continually monitor, can you I'm not as familiar with some of the, what is compression and position bloat?
Sure.
And how are you defining equity there also?
Great. So there's a few different definitions for each of those. So I'll start with equity. Equity could mean a number of different things. It could mean peer equity. Let's say that we have, and I'll just keep using the accountant as an example. Let's say that we have 2 accountants. They sit in the same exact position. They do the same exact job, right? They're peers in that way. So we would be looking at peer equity. If they have the same education, if they have the same experience, then they should be paid, equitably to that. Let's say that we need to hire a new one, and they've got 20 years of experience, and they've got all sorts of, they've got a CPA, they've got all this different stuff that might that might qualify a higher level of pay, that creates some pure equity issues with the other people that are in that same position, which can be allowable so long as we're able to justify it. So we do look at that for every position that comes through. It could also be with compression, it could be a compression between positions as we look at our pay grades. As I mentioned earlier, there's only 5% between our position midpoints right now, and best practice is going to be somewhere around 10% for non-executive positions. So
Can you give me an example of I'm still not understanding
Sure.
compression.
So let's just, and I'm just going to throw some rough numbers out of
Sure,
my head here.
that's
They're
fine.
not going to be exact. But let's say that we have one position in pay grade 1 and the midpoint for it is 50,000. Pay grade 2, the next position is 55,000. Right? So there's only $5,000 between those two, and I'm sure that's not exactly 5%. But what we try and do is create enough distance between positions that we don't have them sitting so tightly on top of each other.
That makes sense. And then position bloat is just too many people in,
Position bloat is essentially where we have positions that are created, not necessarily for a purpose, and we have too many of them. Or we have too many of the positions that we may have let's just call it specialist 1, 2, and 3. There may not be a discernible difference between those job functions, right? You also see that between like regular specialist and senior specialist, things like that, right? So it's looking at those to make sure that, okay, do we need both? Do we need all three? Do we need one? What do we need for that to make sure that it's configured correctly?
okay. And when you were talking to Councilman Roman and he asked about merit, you used the phrase equitable merit distribution.
Sure.
Can you explain that?
Sure. So that would be making sure that when we're distributing merit increases, because it would generally be based on a range of, maybe say you get somewhere between 2 and 5% based on performance. What we want to make sure is we go back to thinking about pure equity. If we have two people who sit in the same position, they do the same job. Let's say that they even receive the same performance rating, but one gets a 5% and one gets a 2%. There's not really any equitable distribution of that merit raise because they both receive the same rating. So why did one get this and the other one get this? It can lead to things like favoritism, things like that. So
How would that happen? Can you give me an example of how one would get 5? In your example, I'm not understanding how one would get 5 and one would get 2.
it would be based on the supervisor. The supervisor would determine who gets what
Okay,
based on the review that they give for each of those folks.
okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Neal.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I have a question surrounding the median midpoint that you're deriving from the data of the Metro partners, the public and the private.
Yes, sir.
Did you also consider, or did you find a large disparity between the public and the private?
Yes.
And second to that, did you find that the private, or did you factor in some of the benefits that we offer here in Farmers Branch where the private may or may not, such as the 4 10-hour work weeks, the 20-year retirements, the benefits on day one that we offer? Did you factor all that in and how that plays, and help me understand how that private related to those types of things?
Sure.
To
Generally-
derive that median.
Yes, sir. So generally in the private sector, we do see the salaries are higher, and that's a pretty common thing. Private sector is hard to compete with because they're mostly all revenue generating for the most part. So, whereas we are not. So we did look at that. We did see that disparity, and I would say it's somewhere generally based on the position and the job family, somewhere anywhere between 3 to 10%. It's going to be based on positions. Some positions are unique to cities, and we may not be able to study that position, so we're only using the city data for that position. So we did take that into consideration, and we weighted them differently to make sure that we weren't putting too much emphasis on essentially the private sector, which we know is going to have this common gap. So from there, the second part of your question, can you repeat it one more time?
Well, I'm just wondering, just to follow on your comment there, did you put a valuation on these benefits that we might offer in the public arena as to the value of those things versus the private?
Not as part of this study, we did not, because it's something that everybody may choose something different, and some people may, for example, the valuation of, let's say, somebody who's on employee-only benefit plans is going to be a different valuation than somebody who's on our family benefit plan, things like that. But things like the 4-day work week, the 40 hours at start, those are things that we didn't put into this as it was purely a salary study. But that's where we close the gap in our recruitment efforts
exactly.
when we're talking to candidates and we're going to job fairs. That's where we don't hardly ever talk about salary at job fairs. We're talking about all these great benefits that we sell to folks, and then they go and apply regardless of the salary.
Yeah, I was just trying to zero in on how you reach that median number and the
Yes.
factors, particularly from the public-private disparity and benefits. So
There's no total compensation included in that amount.
that's all. That's all. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. So this is important policy information that we need to digest, because this is your decision to make as to whether we will adopt and follow this policy. You're not doing it tonight, but I'm sure we'll have more discussion about this as we get further into the budget discussions. Correct?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Next up is B4, receive a report on the State of Texas Event Trust Fund grant for the United Pickleball Association. Oh, yeah.
Good evening. So tonight we have a two-part series for the Event Trust Fund grant with the UPA. So we've been talking the last two council sessions about the State of Texas grant. Thank you. So we've been talking the past few times about the State of Texas grant that we are helping to pursue with the UPA, the United Pickleball Association. Last year we had nationals at Brookhaven Country Club. This year, we're helping them apply for a state grant. And a part of the state grant, first of all, there's the venue. I know y'all saw it. Y'all probably all went last year. A part of the state grant that the city of the Farmers Branch is part of is called the local contribution. The local contribution is part of our hotel occupancy tax fund. When we say, oh, the HOT fund, and it's the acronym we use, the HOT fund is every time you go to a hotel and you go pay your bill and you think, oh, the rate for the bill is whatever, then how is it a little bit more? It's because you pay a local tax, and that local tax can only be used for funds supporting what we call heads and beds. So this is not from property tax. It's not from the general fund that Tammy just mentioned. It's from the bill for visitors. So for the hotel occupancy tax fund, the local contribution can help fund certain things that the city needs. The contribution can be reimbursed back to the city, or a portion of it can stay with the applicant. In this case, we're the applicant and we're doing it on behalf of the UPA. It's the Pickleball Association. And so a little bit later, I know we're going to talk, and we have a executive session item to talk about business incentives and retention. So we know there's competition for this event. That's why the state of Texas does a grant for it. And so we can talk about those things. Last year, the city participated in a sponsorship because we did not do the grant last year. So we did a sponsorship to help with shuttles. So if you went last year, you probably saw several shuttles coming and going from the venue. Our tourism department worked with UPA to get funding for the shuttles, and we also did colored wristbands and signage on the shuttles. So if you're staying at the Sheraton, you did not want to get on a shuttle going all the way to the Renaissance, opposite part of town. So all of those things, they happened. We participated in it with a sponsorship last year. This year, we're going to talk about the local contribution being the way that we pay from the same fund for similar activities. Tonight, I am just briefly discussing the local contribution and what it is. And in a minute, we're going to go into a closed session to talk about business incentives and how to retain perhaps the event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Folks, we're going to skip ahead to item B7 at this time. Discuss the status of multifamily developments in Farmers Branch.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. Marcus Narvaez, Deputy Director of Planning. So not long ago, we were posed some questions regarding the status of apartments within the city. And there were also some capacity concerns. So this is what this item is really to do, is to address any of those concerns, have a good discussion about multifamily statuses currently. No action is obviously being taken tonight, but this discussion obviously is going to help us as far as staff when we work with developers here in the future. So we initially looked at single-family data. We've grouped together our single-family types in this particular case. This would include single-family homes, townhomes, condos, vacant lots that are slated for future single-family homes, as well as duplexes. And looking at it from a land use perspective, overall, there's about 27% of the land in the city that is used for single-family housing. We go one step further in this case, and if we group all of our housing types, so if we look at all single-family housing, including multifamily housing combined together, we're looking at essentially about 36% of all housing types are made up of single-family homes in our city. So on the flip side, we will have essentially over 16,000 multifamily units in our city. And this is mainly because over 11,000 units already exist in our city. There's another 500 units that are currently under construction. In addition, there's another 4,600 units that have not been constructed yet. But those units are allowed by right. So they're coming one day. Now, from a from a land use perspective, multifamily units make up only about 6% of the actual area, per se, within our city. You really see that only because we don't really do garden-style apartments in our city. We do more of that urban-style apartment. So that tends to be high density, but a lot less space. Now, when looking at it from a housing type perspective, multifamily makes up about 64% of all of our housing units. And again, that's combining multifamily units with single-family units combined together. So typically, we always divide our city into 3 sections. And we know there's the west side, there's the central side, and there's obviously the east side. So when considering the 16,000 multifamily units within our city, I can tell you that 51% of those units fall within the west side. There's about 13% of those multifamily units that fall within the central area of our city. And to go one step further, there's essentially 37% of multifamily units on the east side of our city. So I think it's also important to note that we have a couple of PDs that are structured differently within our city also. PD 86 has been in existence for many years. That came to our city June of 2005, but it's very difficult to quantify this particular area. And you can see that a portion of PD 86 falls on the west side, and there's a portion of PD 86 that falls on the central side. And it's difficult to quantify only because there are no maximum heights, and there are no maximum unit counts within PD 86. This is essentially because that's how form-based code works at times. And that's essentially how this particular PD was approved. So instead, this particular PD has highly restrictive regulations that includes open space, parking, streetscaping, and architecture. I can say that the standards are pretty high, otherwise I think we would see more development happening. Now again, to date, we have Presidium, which is planned to be developed. That's just in front of the Star Center or next to the Star Center. And Havenhurst is another example of an apartment complex that's following the PD standards. Both of those developments had to go back through the process because they couldn't adhere to every single standard that we had within this PD. But still important to note that we have areas in the city where we have no definitive count when it comes to units. So something to keep in mind. I do want to point out our future land use plan. You'll notice on the screen the dark yellow areas where my cursor is located, and the orange areas. These are designated they signify higher density areas. And if you look at our future land use plan, which we always reference, the densities can range from 12 to 65 units per acre. They can also range from 12 to 50 units per acre. Now, again, just so everybody understands, we're always going to cite the plan. We always look at our plan. Every time we bring a staff report to council, we're always going to let you know what our future land use plan is saying. But we know it's only a guide, and it's not an ordinance. So this is more of just for us to be able to justify when we bring projects to you, let you know what has been approved or what our future land use plan consists of. So with that, we can have a discussion about multifamily. I would be interested to know where council stands on a lot of this information. And again, that only helps staff in working with developers in the future.
All right. Councilman Roman?
Yeah, so, one of the things that I often hear from some residents is that we're oversaturated with apartments. And I think as I sit here as a council member and I listen to presentations of multifamily projects coming forward, I can't help but to think and remember what these residents have shared with me. After all, part of our job is to listen to our constituents and represent them in the best way that we can. But where I find it difficult sometimes is to understand objectively whether we are under, over, or rightfully saturated with multifamily.
Right.
Because, someone may drive through the west side and say, oh, that's way too many apartments. Someone else may drive by and not notice them at all.
Right.
And so I'm trying to understand, and that's part of why I asked for this item, because
Sure.
I'm trying to understand how objectively we can determine that. Is there a specific standard that exists in the industry? How do we compare to other cities? So that, should someone mention, hey, I think we're oversaturated,
Right.
then we can say, well, we've conducted a study, we've looked at this objective data or measurement system that indicates that we are under, over, or right where we need to be. So just in your experience, I'm just curious to understand if such a benchmark exists.
No, well, not necessarily. I mean, every city is going to be different, and it's going to depend on. It falls back to the comprehensive plan also. I think the comprehensive plan really, that's the document that we take out to the city, we take out to the citizens, we take out to the constituents, and we say, hey, look, what do we envision for our city? Now, again, we can always compare ourselves to Addison or to Carrollton, and we can definitely do that. We can do that research. Not a problem. I'd be thinking about Addison. I think they're probably closer to 90% apartments of anything. I mean, you can tell when you drive through there, they're either apartments or they're restaurants. A lot of times it has a lot to do with community character or characteristics that the city wants to retain. And I think in this particular city, there's that idea of wanting to retain some suburban characteristics and not necessarily become just multifamily and restaurants for the most part. At this particular point, knowing that we're at a particular percentage, and again, I think I had mentioned earlier, we were on the cusp of about 65% when you look at all of our units within the city. In addition to that, I don't necessarily really see us having more single-family subdivisions created in our city. There's no land, So if anyone's going to build more residential units in our city, the kind of requests we're going to get are for multifamily, without a doubt. Unless someone is going to raise part of the east side, blocks of the east side, and actually put single-family homes, but the likelihood of that is, it's not likely at all. You know, at the end of the day, it comes down to what us being a home rule city, it comes down to where we feel comfortable hearing from hearing from your constituents, hearing from the citizens. That's typically how a lot of cities end up with a certain baseline. Now, the city I worked in before, they had a baseline it was written into their comprehensive plan not to go over a certain percentage for multifamily. So they were open to only having about 10% of all of their housing units to be multifamily. The other 90% needed to be single-family type. In our city, right now, just according to our statistics, we're already at 65%. So even if we wrote something into our comprehensive plan, we could try to stay at around that 65% for the most part. It's almost like putting a moratorium on apartments. We just don't zone any more apartments in this city. We allow the other 4,000 to still be constructed because they're by right, without a doubt. It's when you get to some of those PDs that we have out there where there are no limits, and it's allowed by right already. PD 86 is another good example of that, where if somebody comes in and they want to construct apartments in this area and they meet all of the standards, I don't have to go to city council. I just bring it through the process and they can construct. So I think getting that information back from city council and us adopting some of that into our comprehensive plan, that, in my mind, creates that baseline standard for our city. That's what I would recommend for the most part. Hopefully that answered your question.
Well,
Yeah, sort of.
it sounds like it's just sort of continues to be a subjective measurement tool.
Yeah, and it really depends on what kind of city we want to be. If we want to lose the suburban characteristics of our city and we want to be more urbanized, we want to see more entertainment, and we want to bring in more people, we need to allow these apartments to continue in our city. If that's the type of characteristic we want to see in our city. But if we want to retain a certain look and feel and not lose that, then yes, coming up with a certain baseline that staff knows, is obviously attuned to, and we are able to convey that information to the developers as they come in, would be beneficial and helpful. And that would saves time, I guess, ultimately, instead of having people just go through the process knowing that there's no way something like that's going to get approved in our city. It's something to think about.
Okay. I think that's it for now.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Councilman Reed?
I have a question. Has there ever been a study done on the transients as far as the multifamily? Like, what's the average residence time? Is it 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 1 year for a lot of these apartments?
No, not that I'm aware of, sir. I don't know of a study. You're talking about like how long somebody stays in an apartment before
Correct.
they move on to maybe a condo or townhome or single
Right,
family
or
home.
just stays in the area?
No, that's something we could definitely look at. I wouldn't have an answer on that per se.
I was just asking if something like that's ever been done.
No, not that I'm aware of. Again, folks that stay in the apartments, it could be folks just starting off for the first time, people wanting to downsize. There's so many different reasons why folks would want to stay in an apartment for sure. But no study that I'm aware of, sir.
And the reason why I ask, you look at the west side where it's, 51% of all the multifamilies are there.
Yes, sir.
And you look at the type of community that gets built, because if there is, and I don't mean to use transient in a negative
Yes, sir.
connotation.
Absolutely.
It's that versus permanent. But with that high concentration of transients, it seems difficult to build a community type feel
Yeah,
in those areas. And that's a concern that I have.
sir.
So just wanted to throw that out there. And when you say allowed by right, does that simply mean that it's zoned for that type of housing? And it, like you said, as long as they meet the requirements, there's nothing we can really do to,
Correct. Yes, sir.
okay.
Yes, sir. Yeah, they have the right to construct whatever that information that's associated with that ordinance for that location. They're permitted to adhere to that. As long as they adhere to that, they're permitted to build that.
Okay. And the last thing is, being from that area as well, with that large amount of dense population with minimal amenities there, is it, at least for the red areas, is it too late to change things that would require some sort of, retail component like the PD 86, where there has to be some sort of additional services put in place?
Right. Yeah, it's dependent upon the property owner. The property owner would have to bring, so for instance, let's say somebody was developing, like in this large red area, and they're not able to adhere to certain aspects of that ordinance, right? They would have to bring that ordinance back for an amendment. And at that time, when you bring an amendment back to our city, and I'm not sure if everyone's aware of this, but anything is open to change within that PD. It doesn't have to be that specific request that they're asking for. So let's say that PD is 50 pages long and there's all these different items that are associated with it, but they can't meet this one item. Well, technically, the PD is open. And at that point, if there are things within that PD that need to be looked at and re-reviewed, that's the time to do it, in my opinion. But other than that, there really isn't a way, unless that property owner brings that PD to us. That's instilled. That's the law for that ordinance,
Okay.
essentially. Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. That's all I have.
Yes, sir.
Councilman Baird?
So are all the 4,500 proposed, those are all by right?
Yes, sir.
Are there additional ones by right? Like, is there additional land that's owned and could be?
Yes, sir. That brings me back to PD 86. Everything that you see pretty much within that red box could potentially turn into multifamily, potentially.
Right.
It hasn't. It's been around, I mean, this area's been around, this PD's been around since, again, 2005. The only two apartment complexes that have really come to fruition, again, would be Presidium, which is next to the Star Center, and then Havenhurst, which was originally an older apartment complex. They're tearing that down. They're putting a newer complex in, although they are adding additional units to that also as well. So, it's one of those things where I think the standards are very high in PD 86. So that's why it hasn't just completely redeveloped quickly. But again, there's really no limit on PD 86. So it's kind of hard to quantify for that particular one. There's one other area that I guess I should, let me point out. In this location at Luna Road and Valley View Lane, there's another multifamily, I guess allowed by right multifamily land area. This is part of, I believe, PD 99, and with that particular one, we don't have a site plan. So, and there's no unit count associated with that. So it could go in as an office, it could go in as retail. If they do multifamily, it's required to have retail on bottom. But again, there's no limitation on the number of units. Really just the space is the limitation. So it's hard to quantify. Without a site plan or
Sure.
without a conceptual site plan, it would be hard to say how many units they would fit on that. So a lot of the numbers that I'm presenting to y'all right now exclude these items only because we can't quantify that,
But they'd still have to have enough parking and
Absolutely.
all of those things. So-
Exactly. It doesn't mean that they can't go, 8 stories tall or something. They fall into a different
Right.
construction type.
Right.
You go from wood framing to steel framing by that time. So that usually gets really expensive.
So all of the residents who I've heard from to a person say, we have enough.
Understood.
And you're saying 64%, I think?
64, 60, almost 65% of
multifamily,
all
okay.
housing units in our city, yes, sir.
And, I tend to think that way too, city in a park, little hometown feel, whatnot. If somebody has by right, but it hasn't been developed, and we were to change the zoning for that property, and then it is sold, are the new owners now, can they build what the current owners, or does it go under the new zoning when it's sold?
Right, so the zoning stays with the land. So when the land is sold to
Okay.
another person, they retain that right. It can be retained over and, I mean, it could be sold 10 times, but the zoning stays with the property. So 10 owners down the way, they'd still have the right to be able to build those apartments. Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, we wouldn't have the ability to just go in and rezone it and change it without the property owner's permission. The property owner would have to be the one to rezone the property.
It may be a little bit more complicated than that, but generally, if the owner has a vested right in the apartment or multifamily zoning, we can change the zoning all day long, but they'll always have that vested right in the land. If they have no vested right, if they have not submitted any kind of a permit application or haven't announced an intent to begin construction of a multifamily, we can change the zoning all day long. I mean, we initiate the zoning ourselves, and we can do that, but it has nothing to do with changes of ownership. And Marcus is right, zoning runs with the land. We can change the zoning all day long, but it would not come without some, disruption. Zoning is a public process.
Sure.
And the property owners that own that land, all they'd have to do along the way is just submit an application for, a site plan approval when their vested rights then get locked in. And once those are locked in, it goes with the land just like the zoning does. So it's possible to do, but it may be in some circumstances difficult.
Which most of these, we have site plans already. Like, we have site plans that are embedded with the PD. So the land has these approved site plans associated with it. There's a few out there that we don't. PD 86, this one that's up on the north side, no site plan has ever been submitted to us on those.
Okay.
Or adopted with the PD.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Neal?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I know, Marcus, you're looking for some feedback from us, and I've just recently gone through an exhaustive campaign to get elected. And I will tell you that I knocked on a lot of doors,
Sir.
and a majority of them are not in favor of additional apartments. So I want to just take that forward, and I'll be supportive of my constituents against additional apartments. But that being said, I understand there's apartments that are allowed by right, and there may be little that we can do about that at this time. So that being said, do we know or do we have any updates or reporting regarding current vacancy rates across the board on all those apartments that we currently have? Do we know?
We don't have the vacancy rates. I can tell you right now, normally when we calculate the number of folks that we assume are within these areas, we typically assume 98% not being vacant, like they're occupied for the most
98%
part.
full.
98% full, absolutely. That is information we could try to acquire. A lot of times obviously, the best option is just to contact each apartment complex and get that information from them. I know the Council of Governments tries to acquire that type of information. Of course, it's so fluid and it changes regularly. Typically, when you see apartments still being constructed a lot, that usually means that's a supply and demand situation. So if there's a demand for it, they're going to keep building them. But I would the assumption is that they still hold a pretty high occupancy rate. That's always something that we can always look at and try to get more information on, absolutely, if you'd like.
Yeah, it would be helpful.
Yes, sir.
Because if they're only 50% full, do we really need more apartments?
Understood.
I doubt it's 50%, but whatever the number is. So
Yes, sir.
just one or two other questions, and you may or may not have the answer to this, but how are we as a city, from an infrastructure standpoint, holding up in support of these apartments? Because I'm sure it probably puts additional burden on our water, sewer, maybe even police and fire.
Yes, sir.
Are we positioned to handle these pretty good, or is it a non-factor? Where does all that stand?
We'll
Yeah,
call
I
it
can-
Public Works.
Yeah, I can turn it
Ryan
over
Sauter,
to.
Director of
Sir.
Public Works. Fortunately for us, our city was built in a way where we were oversized in pretty much every capacity you can consider. We have 17 million gallons of storage within our city with elevated and ground storage tanks. And right now, we're pumping out between 6 and 8 million gallons a day. In the summer, we reach our peaks of about 16 million gallons a day. There's always a study that is provided by the developers. It's an impact study on the sewer and water system. And if there's any increase in water mains or sewer mains as part of the development, then they're required to install those per our requirements and our specifications. But from a
you.
standpoint of the utilities itself, we're in very good shape.
Okay, thank you.
You good?
Yeah, I think that's.
Okay. So, Marcos, I have a couple of comments, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong. Sure. So, first of all, the question was asked, do we have any information or metrics as to occupancy rates? Well, obviously, the market's going to dictate that, and if we weren't in such a healthy market, then occupancy rates would probably reflect themselves in lowered rents somewhat. I don't know. We have somebody here who's an expert in this that could probably chime in on that. But it's up to developers to do their research to determine whether apartments are a viable business interest in our city. It's not up to us to tell them that. Same thing with hotels. We had a study done and presented several years back about hotels and whether we were over-hoteled or not. It's not up to the city to determine whether we are over-hoteled or over-apartment, over-multifamilied, I should say. It's the developer's responsibility to do that. Obviously, they're going to look at occupancy levels. That information is proprietary in most cases. I don't know that they're necessarily going to share that with any of us. That's their business interest. And then something else to look at is the physical condition of the properties. You know, Farmers Branch has a lot of newer multifamily sites in the city, and so those are going to tend to command better rents. That's not to say that the older facilities, because we do have some very old ones that are or appear to be fully occupied. Okay? They don't command the same rent per square foot, but yet they are a viable housing source for some individuals who choose to live there.
Sir.
Fair enough? Okay.
Yes, sir.
The time in apartments. Again, I don't know that any developer is going to share that on average. How long does somebody live there? I will say, as an investor in multifamily that I've been in the past, we set criteria. We go in and build a development. There's a target set ahead of time. So I know once that complex reaches a certain occupancy level, it's going to go up for sale because we want to get our money out. Plain and simple. So, what can we do? Moratorium? No, you can't do that. It's against the law, correct? Moratorium. Thank you.
Right.
You can't say no to areas where multifamily is allowed by right. And that is probably one of the biggest misconceptions for some of our residents, because they have come repeatedly to council meetings and say, no more apartments, just say no. If we need to change our code, go to a different form-based code, so to speak, that's a different story. But we can't limit what is allowed by right, correct?
And it really depends on your zoning, obviously, whatever is zoned for multifamily and whatever those unit counts are, absolutely allowed by right. I think where council has a say, obviously, is zoning is discretionary. We all know that. So if somebody comes to us on the east side and wants to rezone something from light industrial to multifamily, obviously, market analysis, all of that is really important. We should be able to we should be able to get that type of information so we know that whatever apartments you're bringing in are not going to necessarily be vacant, and it's going to depend on the market, absolutely. I think from an infrastructure standpoint, like Ryan said, obviously we have the capacity in that sense, but, I don't know, and I'll just go out on a limb here, but, it depends on, I'm not saying that the city's desperate for apartments, but at times we can always try to get the best product we can. So, there are cities out there that are dying for apartments, and we don't have to necessarily be dying for apartments. We can take our time, look at the case, try to get the best product, because I think, again, we want products like the mayor alluded to also. You want products that are timeless. Architecture is very important, obviously. We're not looking for something that's just going to look bad in 5 years. So, when we get these types of cases, we try to be very meticulous about them. Trust me, the items we get initially, by the time we bring it to council, it's made a complete facelift and change, and we've added in as much when it comes to pedestrian amenities and so on and so forth. Highly amenitized apartments that could be a value, absolutely are a value to the city, without a doubt. When you think about it, these apartments sit on these small parcels that you're able to expand upon the tax base, obviously, within a small area, without having to lay down new water and sewer lines and new roads, when you think about it from that perspective. Which typically with a single-family neighborhood, we end up taking all of that and maintaining it in perpetuity. So there's positives, there's negatives, but that's really where we stand on. From staff's perspective, we always look to our comprehensive plan, and we obviously look to whatever information we get from council. And that's where we go with.
So let me just finish up where I was going.
Sure.
So you had mentioned determine a baseline. That was a
sir.
phrase that you said, and I think that's really important. So to that point, the city manager and I have already had conversations about sometime later in the year having a town hall meeting to discuss not only multifamily, because that's a big issue, but also code and code enforcement, probably the two biggest issues in the city, and getting better citizen input rather than sitting downstairs and letting people just fire at us for 3 minutes. Let's truly engage with our residents and let them have the say. We talk about how do we satisfy the critics? Well, we have to listen to them. We have to listen, and we have to give them the opportunity to say what's on their mind. But they also have to know, as we do too, it's a balancing act.
It is.
We're juggling the future of the city, and their input is very, very important because they are invested here. But then so are the businesses that are here. They're invested here too. So we'll have that discussion and give everybody plenty of lead time on that, and the whole council will be involved in that. So that's all I wanted to say.
Absolutely.
Okay. Stacy? Okay. So, could we ask, Lucy Billingsley is here, and so I'd like to ask her if she had some comments to impart some additional wisdom.
Really, what I'd like to do is know any questions you all have, because I can pull the data together. So if it's about how long somebody's living in a place, we can go for our own apartments and say, what are the averages? We can just say how long have people been there? What are the occupancies in the city? Easy for us to get, because you don't buy into those services, but we have to. So if you all can just, push questions forward, we'll just give you all the information we can, and that just helps have a little bit more knowledge and insight.
So, okay, in that regard, send your questions to Ben. Let him run them to Lucy and copy Marcos, what have you. So thank you for offering to share that information with us. Okay. We're going to take a little break right now since food is here, and then we have to be downstairs at 5 o'clock. So we will probably finish the rest of this after the regular meeting, okay. And then we'll have executive session after that. So we will recess at 4:40.